all got that one relative, haven't we? You know, the one you don't see very often that recoils in horror when you tell them like playing video games, and then usually follows up said recoiling with a lecture on how video games will warp your mind and you might want to be careful, otherwise you'll be magically influenced to walk into your local Tesco and beat innocent shoppers with a club. Or something. Indeed, despite the fact that there have been, to date, no scientific studies that have proven unequivocally that video games cause violence, people still happily buy into the idea that playing video games will lead to real-world atrocities. But why is that? Why, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, do politicians and the media continue to blame video games every time something bad happens in the world? And why are people so willing to believe it? I, for one, would like to know. Before we embark on our investigation, we just want to flag that we'll be covering some uncomfortable topics, such as murder, suicide, mental health issues, and school shootings. And whilst we'll do our best to remain respectful, these subjects might be upsetting for some, and we completely understand if you don't wish to proceed. If anything we say resonates with you and you need support, we'll leave some links in the description box below. I'm Ashton from TripleJump, and I want to know, why do people still think video games cause violence? For almost as long as video games have been around, people have been clutching their pearls and condemning the media for its depiction of violent behaviour. In 1976, the arcade title Death Race was released, in which players controlled a heavily pixelised vehicle and ran down gremlins, with the aim being to kill the gremlins whilst avoiding the tombstones they left behind. As you can no doubt see from the images on your screen, the gremlins bear roughly as much resemblance to actual living creatures as I do to that bloke who plays the Mountain in Game of Thrones. Though, in fairness, I do have the muscle.
Anyway, the game caught the attention of Associated Press writer Wendy Walker, who felt that it was excessively violent, and her concerns eventually made it to the National Security Council, who accused Death Race of glorifying running people over. Is it February 29th already? Because that is a leap. Just 6 years later, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop began raising concerns that video games might cause violent behaviour, spreading the idea that those who played could be more prone to both physical and mental health issues, despite having absolutely no evidence to back this up. Things went a bit quiet after that, and whilst the idea no doubt still simmered in the back of people's minds, it wasn't until 1992 that the theory of video games causing violent behaviour became a hot button topic again. With the releases of the likes of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, multiple politicians went into full-on outrage mode over the content of video games, and following 2 congressional hearings, the Entertainment Software Rating Board was founded, and from then on, video games were assigned ratings to denote their suitability for children.
Then, just before the turn of the millennium, the situation went nuclear. On the morning of April 20th, 1999, 2 12th grade students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, planted bombs in their high school in Columbine, Colorado, before opening fire on students and teachers. 12 of their classmates and one of their educators was killed, before Harris and Klebold took their own lives. 21 people were injured by gunfire and a further 3 were hurt while trying to escape. Until 2018, the Columbine Massacre was the deadliest high school mass shooting in American history, and to this day, no one really knows why they did it.
Various theories have circulated. Some thought the 2 may have been victims of bullying, others believed the pair's mental health was the cause, and a vocal minority placed the blame firmly at the doors of Marilyn Manson and video games. After it was discovered Harris and Klebold were fans of Manson's music and enjoyed playing Doom, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake, and Postal. Some of the parents of victims even went as far to file lawsuits against the likes of Sony Computer Entertainment America, Activision, and id Software in an attempt to hold the companies accountable for the tragedy, though ultimately the cases were dismissed. The blaming of video games for real-world atrocities continued into the 2000s. Following the release of Grand Theft Auto 3, now disbarred lawyer Jack Thompson tried to sue Rockstar, Take-Two Interactive, and Sony as he claimed that GTA 3 had caused a number of murders, and later he went on to try and sue Rockstar and Sony again when it was alleged that Manhunt was to blame for the murder of Stefan Pekira by his friend Warren LeBlanc in England in 2004. More recently, video games are blamed for the Sandy Hook school shooting when journalists found that the perpetrator had been an avid gamer.
His favourite titles? Super Mario Bros. And Dance Dance Revolution.
Even as recently as 2023, French President Emmanuel Macron criticised the intoxicating effect of video games and effectively blamed them for the civil unrest gripping France following the death of 17-year-old Nahel Mazouk at the hands of the police.
That sure is a lot of accusations being thrown at video games. I wonder if there's anything in it. With so many being quick to point the finger of blame at video games when discussing violent crime, you'd think that multiple scientific studies would have been undertaken. And you'd be absolutely right. But given that we are gamers and not scientists, it all looked a bit confusing. So we decided to go and speak to some sciencey type folks directly.
I recently sat down with friend of the channel Dr. Rachel Coert, who just so happens to be something of an expert on violence in video games, to ask for her take on the matter. Dr. Rachel is a psychologist and world-renowned researcher on the uses and effects of digital games, including their impact on physical, social and psychological well-being, as well as a content creator who not only has her own channel, but has also worked with the likes of ESRB, Bungie and D&D Beyond. I also spoke to another friend of the channel, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, a clinical psychologist and game studies researcher with a master's degree in game design and a background in esports community management and graphic design. She really does do it all. I can see why her friends call her the unicorn.
Numerous studies have been conducted over the years that try to find a link between video games and violent behaviour, but at best, only a temporary increase in aggression has been found.
And I can say that because there has not been one study that has been done that has found that exposure to a violent video game has actually predicted violence in the world. Now, what these studies do is they take a look at what people are thinking or maybe feeling after they play a violent video game, but it would be incredibly unethical to say, hey, play this violent video game and now I'm going to watch you for 10 years to see if you actively hurt someone. The ethics board would not be okay with that. That's not an okay thing to do. And so you get things like the fill in the blank tests where, okay, you went and you played some Call of Duty and now I'm going to give you a series of words that have letters missing and you need to fill them in. So the best example is like K-I blank blank. Well, do you write kiss? Because that would be a non-violent response. But if you write kill, that's a violent response. And that is then coded as violence, as aggression.
Right.
And so even the studies that are really ethical and are very clear, like, hey, after playing this game, people had more aggressive thoughts, that often then gets taken by the media or by news outlets or by people who don't really care about what the research actually says. And then it gets splashed on the front page everywhere.
And what's worth noting is there is a massive difference between violence and aggression. And whilst children in some studies were found to be more prone to shout at or even push people, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest they're prone to do anything more extreme. Dr. Chris Ferguson, a psychology professor at Stetson University, led the committee that formulated the American Psychological Association's policy statement on the matter. And in his words, the data on bananas causing suicide is about as conclusive. Literally, the numbers work out about the same. Now, this is your forte. This is, you talk a lot about it online. If people go to your YouTube channel, they can find a lot of about this topic. But do you think that there is a genuine truth to violence is caused by video games?
I cannot make my face form the correct expression that I want to give right now. No.
Mm-hmm.
There have been thousands of studies looking at the links between real-world violence and playing violent video games, and there is no evidence to suggest that the two are directly linked. Mm-hmm. But this conversation gets very convoluted when we think about how it's portrayed in the media, because you see a flashy headline saying this thing happened and this thing happened, and now they must be put together.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine really likes to say, when you see a violent crime happen and they played violent video games, you might as well say a violent crime happened and they wore shoes, because games are so ubiquitous in everyone's. And also there's no scientific basis to those things.
If this is the case, then why do video games still get the blame for violent crimes? Well, there may be a certain amount of confusion between correlation and causation.
In the United States, around 65% of the population play video games, so the odds are that when looking at the hobbies of people who commit violent crimes, you're going to find that around 65% of them are gamers. That doesn't mean, however, that video games are to blame, and is as ridiculous as saying that because 100% of mass shooters breathe air, the air is to blame for mass shootings, since it doesn't take into account the 99.999% of people that breathe air and don't resort to murder.
One of the challenging things with games is that the idea that playing a violent video game would then incite violence, it seems very common sense, right? Like, oh, this person just played a game where you ran somebody over with a car and then you shot somebody in the back. That sounds really scary, especially for a parent if their child's playing and they don't They're not familiar. They're not gamers themselves. They don't understand the game. And again, there's not a whole lot of education that parents get unless they themselves are gamers like myself. And they're kind of left with what the headlines are telling them. The other part is it's so much easier to have a scapegoat. And that's so much of what it is. If you look at crime, it is related to poverty. It is related to lack of opportunity. It is related to lack of access to resources or healthcare or just basic human necessities. It's linked to systemic oppression and all of these things that we don't want to talk about because they're so complex and they would challenge the very foundations that our governments are kind of established on. And so we could tackle those. We could address those issues. But that's really hard.
Yeah.
So why don't we just point at this thing that looks like it makes sense? It's so much easier and it conforms to what our brains are lazy. I'm going to preface this. Brains are really lazy and they want the easiest answer most of the time.
Furthermore, if video games are to blame for violent crimes, then surely countries with a high population of gamers like Japan and South Korea should be some of the most violent places on Earth. If that was the case, then yes. But according to statistics, Japan and South Korea have some of the lowest rates of violent crime in the world. So do you think it's like a generational thing as well? Because a lot of like our parents just do not understand the appeal of a video game. Do you think like a lot of that misunderstanding of what video games are is also sort of causing this moral panic?
Certainly that's part of it. Although I am constantly surprised. I have this neighbor and I talk about her in a lot of interviews and you know I love you, neighbor. But I have this neighbor who's the same age as me and she has a 14-year-old son. And she very much believes the panic about it. And it's funny because I always thought it was more of a generational thing. And I think it is more of a generational thing.
Yeah.
But when the media is constantly hinging on clickbait headlines and bringing these two things together, it makes sense that people are going to absorb that information. And if they don't know any better, they'll believe it. But to everyone watching, there is no scientific basis that violent video games in any way directly lead to any sort of violent behavior.
I think the important distinction there is that games, the social spaces that games are providing are being co-opted and can be co-opted by people who have violent intent. And that's a very different thing than saying video games cause violence. And so that distinction of, is there stuff that games could do to make their spaces, their social spaces safer, their messaging systems safer, their interactions between people safer? Absolutely. And is it their responsibility? Yes. And they need to do better. There are some specific ones, Roblox, that are notorious and they absolutely need to do better. But is it the game itself training? I've heard people refer to games as murder simulators and things like that. And it's not true. Any space that is left open and unmoderated is going to have unsavory actors pop up in it. Yeah. And if you are afraid to set boundaries, if you're afraid to have fences, if you are afraid to kick people out because they're a revenue stream, but they're still Nazis, then that's a problem. And that's a problem with the industry. That's a problem with a lot of things in the US, not just with games.
Do you think that there is a way that we could combat this moral panic? Or do you think it's going to take just the next fad to come along that people can blame this kind of thing on, outside of, blaming it on the obvious causes of the fact that firearms are so readily available?
Well,
and
certainly, yeah. There's this thing that we did. There's a meta-analysis. I didn't do it. My colleagues did it, where they looked at all of the research looking at what creates violent crime, what leads someone to violent crime. And if you take video games out of the model, and if you take everything else out of the model, in the end, it comes down to personality, disposition, previous exposure to violence, all of these other things. So knowing that and making that logical argument does not seem to quell the moral panic, because that's too complicated. Like people don't want to talk about domestic violence, or they don't want to talk about gun regulation. So I think that what is going to happen is, when VR and AR become more affordable and ubiquitous, it's going to be like, it's not those 2D games.
Yeah.
It's clearly this thing over here now. And then we'll just continue.
Do you think that there is a reason that games are so much more targeted in this conversation than things like TV and movies and books and that kind of thing?
I think it's important to remember that all of those things have been the target of moral panics. The printing press, by Gutenberg's printing press, there were people publishing pamphlets saying that it would lead people to, it would basically make people stupider because it would flood the market with like basically our version of dime novels or penny dreadfuls instead of reading, the classics of like Aristotle and Plato. And so this idea that technology, especially recreational technology, will lead to the downfall of society is as old as human culture itself. Video games, and they are giving way. And we're also seeing a lot of it shift towards social media. So the worries about TikTok and Instagram, where there actually is research that has found that there are damaging effects there as well. Maybe not violence, but still damaging effects. It's just been video games for a long time, largely in a time of the 24-hour news cycle, which didn't really exist when we were freaking out about books so much. Yeah. Or, television. There were plenty of scares about TV rots your brain, da-da-da-da-da. And so it's like everything old is new again. And so we just kind of have to try and do better with the next iteration coming up.
So it would seem that Dr. Kelly also thinks this whole thing is nonsense. Both she and Dr. Rachel did touch on something important though. That video games are just the latest in a long line of technologies that have been shunned by the public for allegedly causing all the world's problems.
I talk a lot about the normalization of hate that we see in games. Like misogyny is very common. Most people have experienced it in gaming spaces. Racism, most people have experienced it in gaming spaces. And when you're in a social group that encourages that behavior, or at the very least doesn't discourage it, there is something to be said about the social learning and processes that are happening there that can then move into other contexts. So if we are going to talk about the harms of gaming, which I think it's important to talk about the harms of everything, even though we love games and we think games are wonderful and brilliant, there is something to be said about if you become immersed in a peer group that reinforces that behavior, it can change the way you see and interact with the world in other spaces, whether that being adopting misogynistic beliefs or things, beliefs associated with racism, or you think it's okay to say a racial slur to someone on the street because you said it in a game and nothing happened to you. So I think that's where the conversation should be about where's the intervention and where should we be concerned.
Yeah, it's more concerning about things like online grooming and the gangs that kind of can prey on the vulnerable in the gaming. But that's not the games themselves. That's the new culture that's around it.
Exactly. And I think that it's important to differentiate that. So when parents are concerned about my kids are playing a violent game, what parents should be concerned about is who are they playing it with.
Although politicians and the media have been blaming video games for all the wrongs in the world for a good few years now, it's important to recognise they're not the only piece of media that's ever caused a moral panic. In fact, humans have been blaming their problems on technology for thousands of years. In 370 BCE, so 2,400-ish years ago, Greek philosopher Plato warned against the dangers of the written word, as he felt people would become reliant on writing things down instead of remembering them.
Fast forward slightly to the 1800s, and the Victorians were getting their knickers in a twist over the emergence of penny dreadfuls, short stories printed on pulp paper that could be purchased for just a penny. These cheap tales were blamed for a variety of crimes and even suicides, with many calling for the publication and consumption of them to be criminalised. In the 1950s, the comic book industry was nearly destroyed thanks to child psychologist Frederick Wortham, when he published his book Seduction of the Innocent. He alleged that comics were to blame for childhood delinquency, based on nothing more than the fact the kids he worked with at correctional facilities liked to read about Batman and Robin's latest adventures.
3 decades later, it was Dungeons and Dragons in the firing line. Much of America and the UK was gripped by the so-called Satanic Panic in the 80s, and people were terrified that a Satan-worshipping cult was responsible for various crimes and were actively trying to influence youngsters. One of the methods people claim was being used to drive children to commit violent acts was Dungeons and Dragons, as they thought because they mentioned demons and fiends, it must be of the devil. One mother even thought that her son killed himself because a DM had cursed his player character, whom she couldn't distinguish from her actual son. So it turns out that video games are just the latest scapegoat for the world's ills. And despite what politicians and the media would have you believe, there's no quantifiable link between video games and violent behaviour. So why on earth does this rhetoric continue? Well, the answer to that is really quite simple. It's much easier to blame video games for societal problems than it is to fix what's actually wrong in the world. It's far simpler to slap ratings on video games than it is to improve healthcare services to ensure that people are getting the help they need for the mental health issues that they may have. It's way less hassle to get a game banned than it is to resolve the economic and educational disparity between the privileged few and everyone else. And in the case of America, it's much easier to convince the public that mass shootings are caused by violent games than it is to get them to admit that maybe, just maybe more gun control would be a good thing. The longer this narrative gets pushed, the longer these problems will continue. So how's about we let the kids play their Dooms and the Mortal Kombats and start focusing on the real issues, like why it takes 18 bloody months to get referred to a therapist in this sodding country.